Today we're reviewing the viral electrolyte powder known as LMNT. Hi everyone, welcome back to my channel. In today's video, we are going to be reviewing a very popular electrolyte powder known as LMNT, or LMNT as you see it on the label. In this video, I'm going to dive into its ingredients, its doses, and whether or not it's a good electrolyte powder for you to try. But first, hi, my name is Katey. I'm a registered dietitian and certified personal trainer. My goal with this channel is to help you learn more about nutrition, fitness, and wellness so that you can be your best, whatever that looks like. I also love to do product reviews, so if you have any products or topics that you want me to cover, just let me know in the comments below. All right, so let's get started. What is LMNT? LMNT is an electrolyte powder company that obviously makes electrolyte powders. The company was founded by 4 different individuals, but their website specifically talks about one of their founders and his discovery of the need for more salt in his diet based on his whole food diet and his activity levels. And so the founders came together and they decided to make LMNT, and their main goal was to create an electrolyte powder that had only the wanted ingredients, none of the unnecessary ingredients, and not too much sugar, which is very common in some electrolyte powders. So in 2018, LMNT became a company and the rest is history. So what is in LMNT? If you take a look at the ingredient list, you'll notice right away that it has a whopping 1,000 milligrams of sodium. And this is quite a high amount. The thing with sodium is that it's not this thing that has to be vilified. And I find a lot of people do think of sodium as being bad for us, but we do need it for our bodies to function properly. So in particular, sodium is important for fluid balance, and it also helps our muscles function properly, among many other things. But in particular to athletic performance, ensuring proper fluid balance as well as muscle and nerve function is really important, and this is where sodium plays a big role. Now, you may be familiar with the recommendation that people should not consume more than 2,300 milligrams of salt per day. And this is the general recommendation by majority of health authorities. Sodium or salt intake is a very controversial topic, and it's not necessarily black and white. And at the end of the day, it really comes down to the individual and their unique needs. However, in order to give broad recommendations to the general public, they decided to come up with this recommendation of 2,300 milligrams per day, or ideally less. In particular, the main concern is blood pressure and heart health, and that's why the recommendation is 2,300 milligrams or less, and in people with high blood pressure, it can be as low as 1,500 milligrams or less. And to be honest, most people do get sufficient amount of sodium in their diet. In fact, majority of the average population, we're talking the entire population, not just health-focused people, on average, the population does get more than 2,300 milligrams of sodium in their diet. And the reason is because most people do consume overly processed foods, which are very high in sodium or salt. And so because of this, there is a very large concern going on that people are getting too much salt in their diet, particularly from processed foods. On top of this, most people are not exercising enough, so they're not sweating very often. They're very sedentary, so they're not moving much. And many of them are at risk of or do have heart disease. So it does make sense from that perspective that there are limitations and recommendations put in place. But here's where things kind of get a little bit in the gray area, because what about the people who are active and they do sweat regularly and they aren't very sedentary and they do eat a very nutritious diet that is mostly from whole foods, and so they don't get a lot of sodium in their diet? Would they benefit from more sodium and maybe not these recommendations? That's the question. Now, LMNT goes into great detail on their website why they believe that the current sodium recommendations are too low for the population and why people should be getting more. Their main argument is that the current recommendation for a low sodium diet isn't necessarily proven by a ton of data for those that don't have heart disease or high blood pressure. They also argue that individuals that are eating a pretty low processed diet, they do get regular activity and are sweating often, most likely are not getting enough sodium in their diet. And they do provide some research to back up their claims. There is some that does go against it. So again, it's a very controversial topic. Because I just solely want to focus on the actual electrolyte powder today, I'm just going to focus on the actual nutrition label rather than getting into this type of information. But before I do that, I do just want to point out a couple things regarding sodium so that we at least get a basic understanding of what the situation is. First of all, if you have high blood pressure or somebody you know has high blood pressure, it is important that they do not consume excessive amounts of sodium. And so they should absolutely be listening to their healthcare provider regarding this. Not my YouTube video, not their website, nobody else, their healthcare provider, because it's a unique situation for that individual. The other thing is that when it comes to disease risk, it's not black and white, and the health world is very nuanced, and it's not something that's this is absolutely going to cause this. Usually there's context that needs to be considered. So sure, excess sodium can play a role in heart disease and high blood pressure, but so can being very inactive, living a sedentary lifestyle lifestyle, our genetics, smoking cigarettes, and overall diet quality. So yes, for the average person, they're likely getting enough sodium in their diet. And when it comes to genetics, some people are more sensitive to sodium than others, and so they can tolerate less or more. But for the average person, they are probably getting enough sodium in their diet from the processed foods that they're eating. And the reason is simple, is because most people do rely on some degree of processing, and the reason sodium is in a lot of these foods is because it helps increase shelf life and improves taste. And around 90% of the sodium that you get in your diet comes from processed foods, not the salt that you're adding on top. So for individuals like that are probably getting tons of sodium through their diet, they most likely do not need to take this electrolyte supplement. With that being said, I find the majority of people that are interested in electrolyte powders aren't that category of people, and they're usually the people that are really, really active and consuming a pretty nutritious diet that is low in processed foods and ultimately low in sodium. And so because of that, their sodium intake may be on the lower end of things, and they may benefit from getting some extra in their diet. Personally, I do sometimes take an electrolyte powder. I don't use LMNT, but I do sometimes take an electrolyte powder. And mainly the reason why is because if I'm doing physical activity where I'm sweating a lot, I do feel that sometimes I'm not feeling fully hydrated after just drinking water. And on top of that, I don't really consume a highly processed diet to begin with. It's pretty minimally processed. So for me, I do find sometimes that when I do have an electrolyte powder with some sodium in it, I feel a lot better. I'm not as fatigued, and I don't get the headaches that sometimes I will get if I feel like I'm really, really dehydrated and water doesn't seem to be doing the trick. So for me, on those days, I will take an electrolyte powder, but I don't do it every single day. So considering all of this information, the issue is that when somebody comes up to me and asks, do I need an electrolyte supplement? The answer is not so straightforward, because really it does depend on all of these things. With that being said, I will say that the 1,000 milligrams in LMNT is pretty high, and very high compared to most other electrolyte powders out there. And it probably is pretty high for the average person who already gets enough sodium through their diet. But there are some people who would not be considered the average person, and they may not be getting enough sodium in their diet. So for example, someone who sweats a lot, someone who does really high intensity exercise, somebody who does a very heavy labor job, especially in the heat, or somebody who is at risk of dehydration, for example, somebody who is sick. These would be people that probably would benefit from getting some additional electrolytes in their diet, particularly sodium. And like I mentioned with genetics, there are some people that also sweat more than the average person, and their sweat tends to be saltier than the average person. And there are a few ways you can tell if you are a sweaty salter. First of all, if you are sweating excessively and you can taste the salt, that's a sign that you might have some salty sweat. Also, if your clothes are commonly stained with salt stains, that's a sign too. Or for example, if you become very, very lightheaded after sweating, that could be dehydration by itself, but it could be a sign that your sodium levels are pretty low. So some people may need more salt than others. And yet again, this makes it all very confusing and unique to the individual. But if you don't meet those examples that I just mentioned, taking an electrolyte powder with 1,000 milligrams of sodium probably isn't necessary for you. Could you get by with a little bit less? Probably. So one thing you could do is, if you are interested in this particular supplement, you could actually just use half the packet and see if that helps before you use the entire thing. If you feel good on the entire thing and it's not against what your healthcare provider is recommending, then power to you. Glad you enjoy it. All right, so now that we've gone into detail about salt, let's talk about the potassium content. So according to the label, it has 200 milligrams of potassium. And just like salt, it is important for fluid balance, muscle contraction, and blood pressure regulation. But the issue here is that for the majority of people, they are not getting enough potassium in their diet because it mostly comes from whole foods like vegetables and fruit. And so we're on the other end of the spectrum here, where most people aren't getting enough, versus sodium, where most people are getting a lot. In terms of the potassium content, I'd say it's a reasonable dose, and I don't have a ton to say about it here. And I do think that it probably will help a little bit. That being said, I wouldn't rely on this supplement alone for your potassium intake in a day, just because it's not even close to what you need. Women on average need about 26 milligrams of potassium per day, while men need about 3,400 milligrams. So the best thing you can do is still absolutely focus on a nutrient-dense diet full of vegetables and fruit, which are abundant in potassium, because this is going to help the most. Then we have magnesium, which is a very trendy but important mineral as well, and it is involved in over 300 different reactions in the body, some of which include muscle and nerve health, which again is important for performance. That being said, if you're taking an electrolyte powder because you sweat a lot and you think that this is going to help, it probably won't won't. Generally speaking, sodium and potassium are the main minerals that are going to be coming out through our sweat. So the magnesium here isn't totally important, but it's not going to hurt either. Beyond this, they do add some flavorings, but this just depends on which one you buy. So for example, in the grapefruit flavor, they add grapefruit flavoring. And then finally, they do have stevia, which is a naturally derived sweetener. The reason I would assume they add this is just simply to give the product some sweetness and improve the overall taste because there is no sugar added to the product. Overall, I would say that the ingredient list is pretty good. I don't really have any concerns and it is very simple. I would say the sodium content is a bit high. If you are an athlete that does sweat a lot or you sweat for other particular reasons, you might need this. For the average person, I still think it is a little bit high and you could probably get by with like half the packet. But again, it's really based on the individual, so it's challenging to tell you if it's good for you or not. Okay, so is LMNT third-party tested? No, to my knowledge, LMNT is not third-party tested. I've tried to look up the reasoning behind it, but I can't really find information on LMNT's actual website, so I've had to look at other websites kind of explaining the reasoning behind it. So this isn't a guarantee, but at least from my understanding, what it could potentially be. So it seems like they don't do third-party testing because they classify their product as being a beverage rather than a supplement. And so that's why they have a nutrition facts table versus a supplement facts table. So it's more of a technicality. What I will say is that it is a pretty straightforward product, so not doing third-party testing isn't the end of the world in my eyes. However, if you are a competitive athlete that does have to have third-party tested products, from my understanding and looking it up on Informed Choice or NSF, I don't see it as being third-party tested, so just keep that in mind. Okay, so now what about the no sugar? It is controversial to have sugar in electrolyte powder. Some people really love it and other people do not want it at all. Sugar can be helpful in electrolyte powders for a few reasons, and that's why some of them do have it. First of all, it does help increase water absorption, especially when it is paired with sodium and potassium. That being said, for the average person who's not taking this for athletic purposes, they probably don't need this assistance and their body's doing it just fine. Where you might need a little help, especially in terms of rehydration, is somebody who is at severe risk of dehydration, or for example, somebody who is sick and is throwing up or has diarrhea, so they're losing a lot of fluids. This is a situation where rehydrating really quickly and where that sugar can help with that increased hydration would be helpful in this case. The other reason is for sports performance. Whether people like it or not, there is tons of research that does support taking carbohydrates for enhancing sport performance. But this is only really necessary for someone who's doing endurance sports. So for example, if they're running like a half marathon or longer, if it's just a quick exercise, you probably don't need it. So personally, I'm not bothered that they don't use sugar in their product. I don't really care. It's not necessary for the average person. However, if you prefer an electrolyte powder that does have a little bit of sugar, I would say definitely keep it under 10 grams. If you like it for its taste or you prefer not to use different types of sweeteners, then go ahead and use the one with the sugar. It doesn't really make that big of a difference in my eyes. But by no means do you need to have sugar in your electrolyte powders, so them not having sugar in it is fine by me. Okay, so now do I recommend LMNT? Unfortunately, based on what we've talked about this video, I can't really give you a straightforward answer, and I know that's really frustrating, but my goal is to be as honest with you as possible. For the average person, I'm talking the average person in the population, I do not think that this high of sodium is necessary. And to be honest, they probably don't even need an electrolyte supplement to begin with because they probably get enough through their diet. However, if you are an avid exerciser and you're sweating a lot, or you don't eat a ton of sodium in your diet because you focus on a mostly whole, unprocessed diet, you might benefit from an electrolyte supplement like this. Especially if you're feeling like drinking water doesn't seem to be hydrating you and you feel like you need something more, or you're experiencing symptoms of dehydration such as lightheadedness, a headache, fatigue, and so on, and taking an electrolyte powder seems to fix this. Personally, sometimes I do notice an improvement after taking an electrolyte supplement, especially when I have similar symptoms to this. With that being said, I think it's so important that I say this, is that if you have certain underlying chronic conditions, so for example, you have kidney disease, you have heart disease, you have high blood pressure, or anything else, you absolutely need to run this by your healthcare provider. It's not something that you should be messing with, and so you really need to talk to them first before just randomly taking 1,000 milligrams of sodium. With that being said, overall, I don't think it's a bad product. If you do want to try it, the thing I would recommend is try just using half the packet first. First of all, that'll save you some money in the long run, but also because you might notice improvements without needing the 1,000 milligrams. So maybe half can actually do the trick. So it's worth at least trying first. But if you find that you're enjoying the 1,000 milligrams and you really like the product, I personally don't think it's a terrible one out there. What I will say is it does seem like the company really cares about this topic and their consumers. In fact, they seem to care so much about it that they actually provide an at-home electrolyte powder that you can make yourself rather than purchasing their product. So obviously they care enough that they're willing to lose profits in order to make sure people are getting enough electrolytes. So I really do like to see that. Overall, this is the worst answer ever, but it is the truth. It might be good for some people and for others it may not be. And that's unfortunately, or arguably fortunately, the reality of nutrition. And with that, I hope you found this video helpful. Let me know in the comments below if you have any other products or topics you want me to cover. And if you did enjoy this video, I would love it if you would like and subscribe to my channel so that I can reach more people like you. And I'll see you in the next video.